There we go. Well, welcome again to a Wilmot Institute live broadcast over our Facebook page from booth 410 at the Parliament of Religions. And we have with us now Robert Atkinson, my old friend. Goodness, I've known you since 1980 or something like that. I probably shouldn't reveal our ages, but I'm afraid our hair does that already. And Bob is here at the Parliament as well. He has 2 talks that he's been giving. And of course, he's also written several books. And maybe we can talk about some of them as well. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your 2 presentations here at the Parliament?
Okay. It's great to be with you, Rob, especially here at the Parliament.
Yeah.
Well, both of my presentations are from my book, The Story of Our Time, From Duality to Interconnectedness, to Oneness. And the first presentation yesterday was a part of a panel of a short 15-minute kind of overview synopsis. And what I did was I organized my thoughts, what I wanted to say, around 3 questions. The questions of how do we view religion? What is the sacred story of our time? And what is the most challenging issue facing humanity today? And it all came from my book on those, to answer those questions. So the first one on how do we view religion, it basically comes down to whether we view religion from a dualistic perspective or a holistic perspective. And I went into a little bit more what it would look like if we did view religion from a holistic perspective or from the perspective of the Creator. And so I brought in the...
Well, that's an interesting way of describing holistic from the perspective of the Creator. That's very interesting.
How else could it be?
It's a good point.
Yeah. So I brought in the symbol or the image of the sacred tree of many branches. That's from the holistic perspective and from the eyes of the Creator. And so we just have to acknowledge, recognize those branches that are there and that have come along at different times, starting with the indigenous branches, which covers all the ancient and modern native spiritual traditions. Then there's 3 sets of branches. The indigenous, the second set of branches are the Abrahamic. And what everyone doesn't often acknowledge is that it's not only the traditions of Moses and Jesus and Muhammad, it's also Baha'u'llah. It's part of that Abrahamic lineage too. So then the third branch of the traditions, the Dharma branches, made up of the traditions of Buddha, Krishna, Zoroaster, and even the other religions, including Sikhism and Jainism, right? So when we look at it that way, we see that not only all the religions, when we look at it as a sacred tree of many branches, we realize also that religion evolves. And so I made that point, and so then that led into the second question of what is the story of our time. And that kind of goes back to the film that many of us saw yesterday here, The Gate, and how in the mid 1840s there was a religious fervor for renewal at that time, and religious scholars were looking in the Holy Land and Persia for fulfillment of prophecy. And it was at that same time that the Baha'i faith, with its core principle of the oneness of humanity, came into existence in Persia. And so that becomes the basis for the story of the sacred story of our time, which also, by the way, is seen in, I mean, there's only one ever unfolding sacred story of creation. And so, and it goes in cycles of renewal. So the latest cycle is that of the Baha'i epic, which is only 1.75 centuries into it, with many more centuries to go for the unfolding of and the implementation of the principles of the oneness of humanity and all the other supporting principles. So we've come quite, I mean, it's interesting to look at it from the perspective of a whole spiritual epic. In a century and 3/4, everybody here at the Parliament understands the oneness of humanity.
Yeah, that's very true.
And then when we look at that sacred story of our time, in terms of what the most challenging issue is for humanity today, it includes all of the supporting principles, but it really is about the oneness of humanity. That's our challenge globally and as a human family, is to bring that into not only as a talking point, but to bring it into reality as a principle that we live by. So those were the main parts of my talk the other day.
That's good.
Today I'm
You got just 15 minutes today, you said, right? Or was that last time?
No, that was the last
time was 50. This time you have more time.
This time I have 45 minutes.
45 minutes, good.
To talk about another section from my book on justice as a principle, as justice as a unifying principle for today. And so I start with the Golden Rule as the foundation for a global system.
You might want to say what the Golden Rule is, because a lot of people might not know.
Yeah, and so there's so many versions of it, from sacred traditions to humanistic traditions and every other. It's basically do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And the interesting thing that I found, there's also another booth here in the exhibit hall where we are, about the Golden Rule, and they have a chart that I use as a slide in my presentation. That slide, that chart includes versions of a dozen or maybe 25, maybe a couple dozen versions of the Golden Rule. And the interesting thing about the Golden Rule in the Baha'i faith is that we have at least 2 versions of it in the writing, maybe more, maybe more versions of it. But the version that's used on that chart is different than the one I use in my talk, because the one in my talk has a preface to it that none of the other versions of the Golden Rule have, which is, in the other version, Baha'u'llah starts out with the preface, "If thine eyes be set on justice," and then the rest of it is pretty much the same. So Baha'u'llah is the first prophet, the first version of the Golden Rule to put it in the context of justice.
That's very interesting.
And so I use that as a foundation for the process that's going on now in the world to build a global justice system. And so it goes back also to Baha'u'llah's writings, where he clearly identifies the purpose of justice, which is to bring about unity
amongst men.
Right. And so I bring in also the whole concept of, so I also look at justice as in an evolutionary perspective or a developmental perspective, showing how we began, except for the indigenous peoples, which I'll come back to in a minute, we began pretty much as after the mass migrations around the globe. We began with a punitive justice system, an eye for an eye.
Right.
That evolved after many centuries or millennia into what we had thought of for a long time too, of certain inalienable rights. And that was around for a couple hundred years or whatever. And then that evolved into a more recent stage of universal human rights as a basis for justice. And now we're realizing more that the only way that universal human rights are going to come into being is if we also accept with that the spiritual principle of the oneness of humanity.
You may have a distraction here. I don't know. They're not too close, but I don't know if people can hear it or not. We'll not sure what we should do. Actually, we have a little parade going by, not too close. What's the title of the book that you've been talking about? You should tell people the book and how it's available.
Yeah, all of that I was just talking about comes from the book, The Story of Our Time, From Duality to Interconnectedness to Oneness. And it is available through the Baha'i publishing, Baha'i distribution service, as well as Amazon and the other usual places.
And I think some of what you just told us about was also the basis of the talks that you gave for the Wilmette Institute about less than a year ago. So you might want to mention that as well. We did what, 3 or 4 talks? 3 talks, wasn't it?
Yeah, we did 3 talks about a year ago for the 3 web talks, and they were also from the book. A little bit different than what I just talked about. They were longer and more broader, but one of the ones that I didn't mention just now that's on the Wilmette Institute site was about the process and the pattern of transformation and how that happens similarly on an individual and collective level, so that we go through our own trials and tribulations and crises that are really meant to move us along developmentally and spiritually to a more mature place, and that's the pattern that exists for humanity as a whole, and we can see so many signs of that going on right now. We're actually in what I think of as the dark night of the collective soul.
Yes, I remember you used that phrase in the talk. Yeah.
And that's like being in the belly of the whale or being in the womb. It leads to a rebirth. And that's what we're all here for, is to help that rebirth process into bringing about the new world that will include living by the principle of the oneness of humanity.
Well, thanks for this information about your 2 presentations here at the Parliament. Thank you also for doing those 3 web talks for us a year ago, and for your books. You might want to mention your other book real quick, your autobiography. Why don't you tell people about that real quick?
Yeah, thanks. I do have the first edition of my memoir came out in 2008, and Baha'i Publishing is going to be doing a 50th anniversary edition of that book, because it's and with a new title. The new title is Year of Living Deeply, a memoir of 1969. So it's coming out in April, and that'll be the 50th anniversary of the memoir and the experiences and adventures in there. But it's about my spiritual journey that led me through the world's religions, a study of the world's religions, and to the Baha'i faith.
Very good. Well, thanks very much, Bob, for this time. I'm very grateful, and thank you for your contributions to the Parliament and to the Wilmette Institute's Web Talk series, and have a safe trip home.
Thanks. You too, Rob.